This is the Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and I'm very happy to welcome back once again historian Michèle Schindler. Welcome.
Hello.
You were just here recently to talk about royal childbirth with me. That was a fun episode.
Yeah, that was great to talk about, and I hope today's just as fun.
Well, we are talking about mental health today, and we're kind of looking at your book called Mental Health in Late Medieval England. And this is a topic that, I'll be honest, I've never covered on my show. I feel like so seldom do I see books on this subject. And it's kind of refreshing because I feel like, to me, mental health has always been a 20th, 21st century idea, right? But we know that this was going on much longer. Your book has proven this. So what got you to choose this as a subject? Because this is a pretty heavy subject.
Well, I was researching the Beaumont family when I was writing about Francis Lovell because his mother was a Beaumont, obviously, and I came across William Beaumont, who was Francis's uncle, and he was mentally ill later in his life, and I was reading up on on his life, and I was surprised at how kindly he was treated because the sort of stereotype you have is that before, as you say, the 20th century and the middle of the 20th century at that, people would have been shunned at best and mistreated at worst if they weren't mentally completely healthy. And at the very best, maybe this sort of illness was ignored, and that's just not true. And I was curious if this was just a sort of single case or if this was more widespread. So I started researching it, and some of the results were really unexpected in a way.
Yeah, that's one of the things I noticed about this book. I think I was pleasantly surprised to see how this was treated in the Middle Ages. While you were researching this, how did you approach these medieval sources and try not to force a modern diagnosis on them? I'm sure there were things that you were reading that you were like, oh, this is familiar.
Yes, of course. I tried not to diagnose anyone any of the people I mention in this book, but just say those were possibly the symptoms that were recorded. For example, Henry VI, and not say this is definitely schizophrenia or whatever it was that was suggested, because we just can't tell. Even today, such diagnoses are difficult, even if you have the subject in front of you and are able to talk to them. So it's just kind of pointless to try and diagnose people at that much of a distance. You can maybe make a suggestion about maybe this could have been this or that, but that's not really the focus. It doesn't matter what they really had. What mattered more to me was how they were treated and how they were treated by the people around them, but also by the medical community, so to speak. How treatments that were supposed to make them better or to heal them, if at all possible, were approached. And that's more interesting than what it was they actually did have, especially because that's just not medieval. The names we have for it today and even the explanations are completely different. Not only would medieval people not have understood them, even Queen Victoria wouldn't have understood them.
I'm glad that you brought up Henry VI, because I feel like he is one of the most well-known monarchs in history with mental illness, and it really affected so many things. Like, it caused the Wars of the Roses, right? And so what did, when you were looking through the primary sources, what did they reveal about how his contemporaries actually understood his condition?
Well, the primary sources are very interesting in that they didn't even try to understand his condition, but they just treated this as a sort of fact. They were saying that, well, he was what we would call today catatonic. He was staring ahead and just not reacting, as one source put it, but they didn't try to analyze the whys. One source mentioned that he may have got it from his grandfather, the French king Charles VI, but that there was even that, which is very, very common as a connection made in more modern history books, wasn't really stressed that much in contemporary sources. But contemporary sources were just more dealing with the consequences of it, saying that's just not possible to have a king who is catatonic, who doesn't react. That's not good. And I think because, well, around the time that his mental illness first started showing itself in that flashy way, of course, you can never say it just happens from one day to the next, but that would have been when it was noticeable. That was when the 100 Years' War was coming to an end, and badly for the English, of course. And the strife in England that would become the Wars of the Roses was just starting up. So they really had better things to do than to analyze why, but they just had to deal with what was happening. But it is interesting that they were actually, even his enemies weren't all that nasty about it. They were just mentioning it. And I think that saying that he was an idiot was about the worst that was said, and even that didn't happen a lot. And of course, for modern ears, it's very, very mean. But for the time, they could have said a lot worse.
Yeah, yeah,
And they did
definitely.
say a lot worse about him, but not specifically about his mental illness.
How did they go about treating this with him? Because, I feel like we know some of the standard ways, but why don't you go ahead and explain how they treated something that maybe they didn't fully understand?
Well, it's interesting. It was treated as a sort of physical illness of a sort, saying the treatments that were used were also used for other physical ailments that people had. They used sort of purging that any sort of, well, poison he may have, even not just poison as in the sense of I'm trying to poison him, but poison in the body. They were pleading him. There was what was suggested was even drilling a small hole into his head to let out the pressure, which isn't as horrific as it sounds because that happens even today, is except probably in let's say better regulated way.
In a
But
more sterile environment,
yes,
maybe.
that too. But the idea that the brain was affected to physical problems seems to have been the ones that especially Henry VI physicians were working with. They used treatments that they would have used for physical treatments as well.
Before I move on to the next subject, was there anything else about the Henry VI case that you wanted to make sure that we cover today?
Well, what's interesting is that non-contemporary sources, even sadly even today, were actually much harsher to him about his mental illness than contemporary sources were. Of course, partly maybe because mentally ill or not, you didn't want to speak too badly about a king
Mhm.
who might punish you, but also there have been books that have been pretty rough about him and saying he was useless, especially because he had a mental illness, as if he could help that, as if that was his fault. And people at the time were just treating it, well, he's unsuited. And they may have said that about a number of other reasons as well.
Yeah, yeah, it's unfortunate, but they didn't fully understand. Not that we fully understand it today either. I feel like there's
No.
still so many questions when it comes to mental illness. Okay,
Yes.
let's move on to the case of William Beaumont and George Neville. This was fascinating reading about this. Uh, this case kind of shows something that feels almost compassionate rather than punitive. What struck you the most about the language used in the parliamentary records?
Well, obviously, by with George Neville, that's an uncle of Warwick the Kingmaker. he was described again as an idiot, which meant just somebody who was not capable of taking care of himself or his possessions. So that's pretty mean as a statement. But that seems to have been just used as a descriptor. It wasn't meant as an insult the way it would be today. So it's more a thing of they used language in a non-discriminatory way that today we understand to be discriminating, but it wasn't intended that way. There's a lot of examples we can probably all think of. And other than that, the language was, especially for William Beaumont, was pretty, well, again, dry and almost compassionate. They were saying, for example, for for George Neville, he lost control of his possessions because they said he couldn't take care of it, which was probably true. We can't be completely certain, but there's no reason to think it was some sort of punishment, but genuinely he couldn't take care of it. And this happens today sometimes. For example, if somebody is mentally ill or somebody is very old and senile, then their family will say they can't take care of themselves anymore. And this seems to have been the case. So his possessions were granted to his brother. That's Richard Neville. That's the brother of Cecily Neville. This isn't helping, is it?
Yes, it is.
Earl of Salisbury, and they said they granted it to him for the love of his brother, so he could take care of it for George. So it was specifically given to him because he would be in a perfect position to do what was best for George. It wasn't given to him to punish George. It wasn't given to him to enrich him, but specifically so he could do what was best for George. Whether this was actually done, we of course can't certify, but this was definitely what was said. So it's at least the theory was that George got the best he could in that moment.
Yeah, I do like to see these delicate moments being handled in a way that maybe I didn't expect. Like you said, like they were more gentle about it. It wasn't necessarily something that they were, I don't know, I don't even want to say looked down on about, but I think they were much more gentle about mental illness than I expected. And that was a surprise to me when I was reading this book.
Yes, it's interesting. Of course, the again, as in the Royal Childbirth book, we have a lot of evidence for nobles, and it's not always sure if let's say normal people would have been similarly gently treated. But it's easy to assume if Richard Neville took care of his brother because of love of his brother, you would think that any commoner would have the same sentiment towards their siblings or parents or children.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Can we talk about William Beaumont and what his case looked like?
Yeah, he's an interesting case because, well, I'm not trying to diagnose people because that's what we said, but they suggested it at the time, but the people who were talking about it, saying that, well, they didn't use the word, but it essentially boiled down to post-traumatic stress disorder because he was known as a gentle type, a non-warrior type, but he was dragged into the Wars of the Roses as a fairly young man of maybe early 20s. When his father got involved and his father died, and William was imprisoned, and then he escaped from prison, and he was in exile for over 20 years, and then returned with Henry VII because William was a Lancastrian. And when he returned, obviously everything had changed. He had left England when he was still a young man in his 20s. And when he returned, his entire family had been, almost his entire family were dead. His sister was dead. His stepmother was dead. Several of his nephews and nieces were dead. The only one still alive, once he had never met before. So obviously that would have been trying for anyone. And I can't prove it, but it's my theory because he came back to England with Henry VII in 1485, and everything seems to have been fine. He even married. And then around the same time that his nephew, that's Francis Lovell, started a rebellion against Henry VII, around that same time, William Beaumont was first recorded to behave erratically and later said to be unable to take care of himself. And maybe that's just the one thing that the only nephew he would be able to remember, his only family he would be able to remember from before the exile was turning against him. And that's when his mental illness maybe got triggered.
Yeah. It's so sad. And I would say I'm not surprised at all that anyone during this time period of history would suffer from PTSD.
Absolutely not. And especially it was said that William was, as a young man, he was considered to be a very peaceful type, who even stated that he said, what was it? Each man should put his feet on his own soil, just leave me alone, basically. And he couldn't. So it's not surprising. But he was stated later on when he was first declared unable to take care of his own possessions and later of himself, that he had behaved in such a way that it could cause injury to the king. And obviously Henry VII was not usually very kind about this. He couldn't afford to be in that time. But he was just saying he sent him to the Earl of Oxford, who was Beaumont's friend, and basically didn't check. So it was just like, it seems either he or someone around him just understood and said, leave him. He's not hurting you. And if he's railing against you, that's just normal.
Yeah. How often did you see in these instances where these people, these cases that we're talking about, that they had somebody in their corner who was protecting them and taking care of them and taking care of their lands because they cared for them?
It was quite often, actually. We talked about George Neville, and in this case of Oxford as well. Oxford was his Beaumont's friend. They had been in exile together for, well, over 20 years. And then when Oxford got his possessions, it seems like he took very well care of them for William. He even spent, when William died, he even spent a lot of money on a very big tomb for him. So that's just not necessary. It didn't even benefit William himself anymore. So it's clear that there was fondness, and he used the money for William and not for himself and throwing him some scraps. So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And Oxford himself is actually a very interesting case because, well, he tried to commit suicide at some point while he was in exile. And that was, of course, considered a sin, a mortal sin, although there was, it seems, more followed in the preach than the observance. So it's interesting that this man, who was noted to have tried to commit suicide, was actually not only trusted, but trusted to such an extent he would take care of his own mentally ill friend.
Yeah. Yeah. There's just something that just tugs at my heartstrings about that story. It's kind of sweet, actually.
It is, yes.
Yeah. And speaking of suicide during that time, I felt like, of course, the most obvious one I could think of was Margaret Beaufort's father, right?
Yes. Well, obviously it wasn't certain he committed suicide, but even contemporary sources, well, they either said it outright or they said that people say something absolutely unsayable and it couldn't have possibly happened. But yeah, people were even at the time pretty certain that he had in fact committed suicide. And well, he was actually buried in on holy ground, which was technically meant to not happen if somebody had committed suicide. Uh, of course, he was quite rich, so sometimes people were just saying it's not officially ruled suicide, so we can bury him. But there were people who were not rich who were also buried in holy ground. So it was a rule, and if it was really obvious, you couldn't subvert the rule, but people tried their best to subvert the rule.
Yeah. I guess this is
Even the church officials they would just say, I haven't seen anything, so that's fine.
just look the other way, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I guess that's something I've never really thought too much about was these cases of suicide and how they were not supposed to be buried in holy ground. For those who weren't, where were they buried? Just like on their land, or how did that work?
It happened on their land, and what is a rumor? It's maybe a German rumor, I don't know, but it's a thing that you grow up and you hear ghost tales about in school and stuff. It's on crossings, on crossings of a certain paths by the road, so to speak, that they would bury suicide victims there.
Man,
And
it's
then
just,
of course it's all these. I know that there are also in England and America these stories about the devil by the roadside and stuff. So maybe that's just where it comes from.
yeah.
But it's this idea that this is where they were buried. And sometimes people were buried next to the graveyard, which probably makes a lot more sense because that's not holy ground, but it's as close as you can get.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. One of the things that you talked about in your book too that I hadn't even considered was people having dementia or something along those lines of memory loss. And I don't even know why I didn't even consider that to be mental illness until I read this. And then I thought, oh, okay. So how did they, I mean, I'm, I guess I don't even know how to ask this. How did they recognize that this was an issue?
Well, obviously it would be if somebody who had otherwise been well, normal is the wrong term. Somebody who had always been able to take care in society. And you even know this from today. If you my grandma who was perfectly able to remember everything and a normal person until she was like 90, and then suddenly her mind started going, and she talked to me about my grandfather who died in 1969. So that would have been the you see they are no longer living in the present. They are forgetting things. They're seeing things that aren't there, and that's the same at the time. And obviously, it was pure. It was pure observance that the older a person got, the more it would be likely to happen. So yeah.
Yeah. So when it comes to treatments, and we only kind of just scratched the surface on this at the beginning, but what kind of treatments were actually used? I mean, when we think of the tutors, there's the obvious ones, and I don't want to answer the question for you, obviously. But when it comes to Henry the Sixth, we kind of looked at the um, maybe balancing the humors and drilling into his skull. What other types of treatments have you come across?
Score more with the college-branded Venmo debit card and earn up to 5% cash back with Venmo Stash. Got paid back? With the Venmo debit card, you can instantly access your balance and spend on what you want, like game day snacks, gear, tickets, and more. The more you do, the more cash back you can earn. Plus, there's no monthly fee or minimum balance. Sign up now at Venmo.com/collegecard. The Venmo MasterCard is issued by the Bancorp Bank N.A. Select schools available. Venmo Stash terms and exclusions apply at venmo.me/stash terms. Max $100 cash back per month.
Introducing Shark Facial Pro Glow, a first of its kind at-home facial. Pro-level extraction removes impurities, and dual temperature technology boosts radiance and deep puffs with both Insta-Heat and Insta-Chill technology. Treat yourself to a hydro-fueled glow in minutes. And because Shark Facial Pro Glow fits in the palm of your hand, you can get that luminous post-spa glow anywhere. Visit sharkbeauty.com to learn more.
Well, as I say, there were the typical ones, also purges and trying to eat better food. For example, with Henry, it seems that it was considered if maybe it was depression, melancholy. So they tried to give him something to eat that was supposed to make this better, which it didn't. But also, of course, there were the more spiritual treatments, prayers. And well, Henry was too ill to do this, but pilgrimages were also suggested, obviously.
Mhm.
So these were things, charity also sometimes, and it's hard to see where it was just cynical and where it was genuinely meant to help. But these were the most typical things that were suggested, balancing the humors on the physical side and religious relief on the other side.
Yeah, it seems quite interesting that, I mean, that diet would be something that they would look toward. Obviously, their diets back then were very different from our diets today, but they would recommend things like maybe a leafy diet instead
Yes.
of.
Yeah, that's, I mean, obviously, even we today know that if your nourishment, if your food is really one-sided, this isn't good for you, either physically or mentally. So it's not that absurd if you think about it. But well, medieval times, it often became just one-sided in another way. You eat a lot of salad, it's fine. If you eat only salad, it's no longer fine. Um, yeah, so that's an interesting point because obviously the humors were thought to correspond with different sort of foods as well as fluids. So yeah, that was where it was attacked.
Yeah.
The tried to get the illness, so to speak.
Yeah, which seems, some of it seems bizarre to us through modern eyes that they would consider this. What kind of, what kind of education did these doctors have when it came to mental illness?
That doesn't seem to have been really a lot of education, so that's a myth. That's probably true, because well, mental illnesses tend to be very individual, much more so than your typical pneumonia or stomach flu, which tends to be the same for everyone. So you had some sort of basics. If somebody is very melancholy, you give him salad, sort of thing. But other than that, you just had to sort of guess, and people weren't really differentiating between physical and mental. So it just looked at something that was mental and guessed what sort of physical illness it could be. So yeah, that's not very helpful, really.
No, I think you wrote, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you wrote a little bit about maybe a patient being bipolar and them recognizing the manic and the depressive part of that. Could you go into that maybe a little bit
Yes,
more?
that was seems to have been what they guessed for William Beaumont, even though they obviously didn't say that. So sort of in modern terms, it would be PTSD, which triggered some sort of bipolar condition, but it was just apparently he was spending untold amounts of money in one, and then just sitting there being depressed, melancholy. And well, it's sort of contradictory for somebody who is trying to work out something with the humors because it's one humor at one moment and the other in the next.
Yeah.
So they were trying to balance it out and trying to, well, only to cure the symptoms, so to speak. And the thing seems to have been if it went in the other direction, then we overdid it, so we do the other thing again, and well, it's sort of a vicious circle, really.
Yeah. Yeah. This is, I don't know, this topic is so interesting to me. I am curious, and maybe we've kind of covered it a little bit, but what do you think medieval people believed caused mental illness in a person?
Well, it was difficult in some ways. We mentioned that they could recognize that it was old age or it was well, the stress of war. In
Mhm.
others, it was sometimes considered it was some sort of a punishment by God, or maybe it was some sort of devilish thing. But also, what is very much under discussed, but seems to have been considered, and which we know now is a thing, is that it was inherited. People did mention that occasionally with Henry VI and his grandfather. Um, so that's something they did recognize caused, well, not directly mental illness, but certainly a tendency to be more mentally ill. And well, then of course it could be triggered, and it could be triggered by you just not being faithful enough, but it could also be triggered by you becoming old, or you becoming too much embroiled in a war. I think what can be said is that they didn't think it was caused by a singular thing.
Mm.
It wouldn't be that if you do this, you will be mentally ill, or you are mentally ill because you did this or that. But it could be said that some things we know are absolutely true, inheritance and post-traumatic stress disorder, and some things that we know do nothing, like not praying enough, that all these things played together to cause some sort of mental illness.
Yeah, it definitely seems like they understood it much better than we give them credit for.
Yes. Although I want to say that in some ways they didn't really see stuff as mental illness we would see now. When think of Joan of Arc, and she was supposed to hear voices, and people just argue if it was saintly voices, if it was given from God, or if it was sort of devilish. And nowadays you would just say it's a mental illness. If you hear voices that aren't there, that's a problem. And
Yeah.
but that wasn't even considered. You would think the English had every reason to slander her and say, well, what is a mentally ill woman doing there? But no, absolutely not.
Yeah. Interesting. Uh, were accusations of insanity or idiocy, like maybe you had mentioned earlier, ever weaponized politically? I mean, obviously Henry VI is a good example of that. Are there any other ones that you can think of?
Well, sometimes it was weaponized in a way that, for example, two brothers inherited something, and one brother wanted everything for himself, and so he said, "This he's mentally ill, he's insane." They would say he's an idiot, so he can't inherit this. But certainly it happened, but it wasn't quite that easy. You couldn't just point and claim. You had to have some sort of evidence.
Mm.
It's hard to say exactly what that evidence is, but there are records of him being saying, and he proved it in front of a court, which means that there was some sort of proof expected. Perhaps, perhaps the brother had to show himself, perhaps he had to speak for himself, perhaps he had to show that he did something or didn't do something that would have been expected.
Yeah. How did this look different when we come to the non-aristocracy, when we come to the more average folk in medieval time and they suffered from mental illness? Were they just locked away? What did that look like?
Not necessarily. Obviously, as I said, their families would also try and get what was the best for them. Some of them were certainly in monasteries or convents, because you would also think that the people there were able to take care of them in the way that normal people who were also maybe working or had 7 kids and couldn't take care of their own sister as well, for example, just could not. And there were also hospitals, Bedlam Hospital, which was actually founded in the 15th century, and it wasn't as bad as it later became known. It was very expensive, so it would have been rich people, although not the aristocracy, who were being treated there. For example, William Ops, who was the royal physician of Edward IV and Richard III, worked there. So it wasn't just anyone, but it was a royally supported sort of hospital. So if you could afford that, that would have been considered a good place to be. Later on, it became not so good, but that was later on.
Yeah.
A lot of what we now think and connect with Bedlam was more like 16th, 17th century.
Wow.
And of course, sometimes, depending on what mental illness was, these people just tried their best to fit into society. And if they had some sort of melancholy or something, they were just treated as best they could and then just went back to work. It's a sort of the old joke where you say, where your grandma tells you, "What do you mean you're depressed? You work too little," and that seems to be a bit of the attitude there.
I feel like some of that attitude still stands today. You just need to work
Yes.
more.
Yeah, that's the thing. What do you mean anxiety? Go wash the dishes.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Exactly. One of the subjects that I'm always interested in, and I don't even know that you're able to answer this, and that's okay if you can't, but one of the things that I think of when I think of the past and them understanding illness is, let's say, Down syndrome is something that's always been around. I would presume it's, a chromosome
Yes.
thing. Is this something that you came across in your notes at all in your research?
Not really, because Down syndrome is, well, the description as such is very, very modern, but there are some descriptions of people who were considered to be childlike or simple and sometimes happy and simple, and you can probably guess that this might have been Down syndrome, but it's also sadly the case that until very recently, people with Down syndrome didn't live for all that long. For example, even in the 20th century, Charles de Gaulle had a daughter who had Down syndrome, and she became 20, and it was considered quite old for.
Yeah. I feel like that's a similar thought in present day too. I have a cousin with Down syndrome and he's in his 50s. And I feel like people these days are even surprised that he's still around in his 50s.
Yeah, that's probably because until very recently it wasn't the case. But nowadays, of course, people with Down syndrome can live quite long lives, which is a massive step forward to what it was even 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah. I just always imagined, 500 years ago or so that it was seen maybe as a mental illness, that they looked at it with confusion, not quite understanding what it was all
Yeah,
about.
probably. But sometimes it seems if we have the description of somebody who's very childlike and we maybe guessed that this would be Down syndrome from the way it is described, that it was just considered that this was, well, they weren't able to really function in society as such, but they were sort of innocent, even saintly in a way. You couldn't understand it, but it was nothing bad.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, This topic is so fascinating. I love talking about it, and I fear like when I have conversations like this that I'm missing important parts of the book. Are there other stories that you would like to share from your research that maybe we haven't yet covered?
There's an interesting one, even though it is sad. It's a German one I think it was the 13th century, where a woman had killed herself, and she was actually buried on holy ground. And then no, it wasn't German, it was Swiss.
Mm.
And then in the weeks afterwards, there were torrential rain. And people had considered that it meant that God was angry, and the poor woman was actually reinterred somewhere not on holy ground to make him be happy again, which is very sad. But it's also interesting
Yeah.
that actually it was the priest, just a parish priest, not some sort of bishop or just another guy who buried her first on holy ground, and it wasn't him who didn't want it, but the population considered it to be well, against God's will.
Mm.
So that's perhaps different than what you might imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. What did you notice about medieval literature and how it portrayed madness, let's call it?
Again, this is very, very well, varied in a way. Sometimes the mentally ill people were the bad guys that happened, and it's a sort of what you expect, but sometimes actually not. And sometimes it was portrayed as passing, and the heroes even had it. For example, the Le Mort d'Arthur. It should be La Mort, just saying. Le Mort d'Arthur, he has Lancelot going into some sort of frenzy at one point, jumping out of windows, and that was when he realized that he thought he had slept with Geneviève, but somebody had conned him. So in modern terms, he was raped. And he reacted very badly to this, as you might imagine. And he's portrayed for several pages to be in this sort of frenzy, and it's portrayed as sympathetic. So that's interesting, as a
Yeah.
sort of reaction to something bad happening or something he did not want to be mentally disturbed by it. And it's portrayed very sympathetically. I thought that was really interesting when I read this book, which is utterly insane, by the way.
I'm intrigued by that it was handled sympathetically, because usually in those situations when something bad like that happens to a man, it seems to be kind of brushed under the rug, so to speak.
Yes, it is really. I think probably a part of it was that it was done with magic. So if you do magic, well, it wasn't at the time it was written really as a sort of crime you later imagine with the witch hunts and stuff, but it was, well, side-eyed. So there may be a reason why this reaction was portrayed like that. But it's still quite sympathetic. And it's interesting, first, as you say, that it happening to a man was treated sympathetically, and the sort of mental disturbance was as well as seen sort of a legitimate reaction.
Yeah. Yeah. This is such an interesting topic. And I highly recommend that you get Michèle's book to look into this a little bit more, because there's just so much in there that maybe we didn't cover today. But to wrap up, Michèle, I want you to answer this question, because if someone listens to this episode and walks away with one takeaway, what do you hope that takeaway is?
I think the takeaway is just to remember that medieval people were also people. So they weren't just some sort of collection of clerical or morality ideas, but people who reacted to their loved ones, their neighbors, even their kings in the best way they knew how to. And some would react in a bad way, and some would react in a compassionate way, as today we might imagine they will as well.
Yeah, yeah. Mental illness is not a new thing. It has always been around. I feel like we talk about it probably a lot more now than they did then.
Yes.
Which is good. We need to continue talking about it, I believe. Michèle, if somebody wants to grab a copy of this book, where can they find it?
Well, it's on the Pen and Sword website. It's on Amazon, of course, and it should be in any sort of biggish bookstore in the US and in the UK.
Yeah, and like I said, I really recommend, if you're interested in mental illness, if you're interested in some of these different topics from history. I think sometimes we just look at the people and maybe the events that happened and the relationships, and we don't so much look at the human condition. This book kind of opens your eyes a little bit to a different side of the world. Thank you so much for joining me today, Michèle.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss a new release. And if you loved it, leave a quick review. It helps more history lovers find the show. Want to support the podcast and get bonus content? Head to patreon.com/tudorsdynasty. You can also find the link in the show notes of this episode. Join the conversation with Rebecca on social media at Tudors Dynasty. Until next time.